He found Elias on a mat of filthy straw. The air was thick with decay, a stench that drew buzzing flies to the figure curled in the center of the room. A single, high window offered only a sliver of gray light, enough to illuminate the cruel shapes of instruments scattered on the floor. Stains marred every surface, the floor, the walls, the ragged matting. Elias, who had always valued immaculate cleanliness, was barely recognizable. His hair was a tangled mess, his robes torn and fouled. His breath came in shallow, almost imperceptible puffs. His body was a canvas of torment. The marks of whips and blades crisscrossed his skin, but the most grievous wound was the searing brand of a single word, slave, seared onto his forehead. Caleb's voice was a choked whisper as he fell to his knees beside the broken form. He was too late. Elias's long lashes fluttered. The eyes that once held the brilliance of polished silver were now dull, clouded with a profound emptiness. He named Caleb, his voice a dry rasp. His wrists, pinned to the floor by two soul-forged shackles, were a ruin of flesh and blood. Elias tried to scrape the grime from his fingers against the floor, a pathetic attempt to be clean before touching Caleb, but it was a futile gesture. With a surge of essence, Caleb shattered the shackles with his blade. He gathered the ruined hands into his own. These were the hands that had once guided his sword forms, that had rested gently on his head in blessing. Now they were as fragile and still as a butterfly's broken wings. Caleb promised to get him out of there, but Elias just shook his head slowly. He managed to hook a finger on the hem of Caleb's tunic. His voice was soft, a gentle current in the suffocating air, as he asked why the Ascendants were cursed with immortality. The ancient law of their kind was that any wound, no matter how fatal, would eventually heal. Their tormentors had exploited this to its fullest extent. Elias no longer wished to live. Caleb forced a smile that felt like breaking glass. He insisted it wasn't true. Before entering this world, he had traded everything he had for a single blade, a sword named God's Bane. He had meant it for his own protection, but now it would serve the one he had sworn to protect. His fingers trembled as he gently closed Elias's eyes. He watched as the faint rise and fall of his chest slowed, then stilled completely. As he struck the final blow against the story's protagonist, the backlash of fate tore through him. Blood streamed from his face as he used his last ounce of strength to cover Elias's body with a clean cloak. He awoke with a gasp, staring at the familiar carved wood of his window frame. A moment later, Leah entered carrying a wicker basket, her voice bright with relief. She was glad he was awake, remarking on the danger of his recent mission to quell the restless spirits. She explained that Marcus had gone to deliver medicine to Elias and would check on him soon. Placing the basket on the table, she uncovered a stack of fresh honey cakes, urging him to try one. Caleb's eyes moved mechanically around the room. Silverwood spire. Honey cakes. This was 3 years ago, back when he had stumbled into a trap while on a mission, and Elias had sustained a serious injury rescuing him. This was the moment Marcus, in league with the Blighted, had used to poison Elias's medicine, a toxin designed to shatter a person's essence and leave them a helpless cripple. It was the beginning of the nightmare. He could still see the brand on Elias's forehead, the ultimate desecration. He sat bolt upright, his hand clenching the hilt of his sword, God's Bane. He asked Leah what she had just said about Marcus. She repeated that he was taking medicine to Elias, praising Marcus for his devotion. Before she could finish her sentence, Caleb was gone. He had to be in time. This time he had to be. Wearing only his thin training clothes, he kicked open the door to Elias's chambers. The sight within was a stark contrast to his memory. Elias stood tall and composed, his white robes pristine, his presence calming the very air in the room. His sword, Solstice, rested on its rack, humming with latent power, not yet a rusted piece of scrap trampled into the dirt. Elias had just taken the bowl from Marcus's hand. Surprise flickered in his eyes at Caleb's sudden entrance. Marcus would not be deterred so close to his goal. His hand, hanging at his side, clenched into a tight fist. He urged Elias to drink the medicine quickly, suggesting with false concern that Caleb must have an urgent matter to discuss. No one would have suspected him. Marcus, the orphan Elias had saved and raised, had always been the model of diligence. His lack of natural talent was overlooked in favor of his tireless work. No one could have known the corrosive envy festering inside him. As Elias's lips neared the rim of the bowl, a primal scream of no tore from Caleb's throat. He lunged forward, his palm striking the bowl and sending it crashing to the floor. Shards of ceramic flew, one slicing across Marcus's wrist. The older disciple looked at him with feigned shock, demanding to know what he was doing. Caleb's voice was a low snarl, thick with a fury he could barely contain. He told Marcus that he knew perfectly well what was in the bowl. The tip of God's bane was leveled at the space between Marcus's eyes. Caleb ordered him to get out, calling him a treacherous cur who was unworthy to be Elias's disciple. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his jaw tight with rage. He glanced from Caleb to Elias, a flash of malice in his eyes before it was masked again. He argued that Caleb was clearly disoriented from his near-death experience, and that he couldn't just make such baseless accusations. Then, Marcus fell to his knees, raising 3 fingers in a solemn oath. He swore to the heavens that he had never done anything so heinous. It was the same act that had fooled Elias the first time. Marcus knew Elias's character, his pride and his trust, and he had used it to methodically drag him into the abyss. Despite the blood loss that left his own face pale, Caleb strode forward and struck Marcus across the face. He declared that fine words were easy, but if the medicine was harmless, Marcus should drink it himself. Using his essence, Caleb gathered the spilled liquid from the floor, coalescing it into a single, hovering glob. He moved it to Marcus's lips, pressing the point of God's bane against his throat as a silent command. Marcus's eyes widened in terror. He looked pleadingly at Elias. Elias moved then, his hand gently covering Caleb's on the sword's hilt. His voice was clear and calm as he noted that Caleb's wound had reopened. In his haste to get here, Caleb had pushed his healing body too far. A dark stain was spreading across his tunic. Elias, though injured himself, channeled his own essence into Caleb, his expression unchanged as he soothed Caleb's chaotic internal energy. Of the many disciples at Silverwood Spire, Elias had always been unfailingly generous. His private grove, cultivated for a century with his own essence, was open to any who were sick or injured. Some grew greedy, but when Caleb had once suggested a system to ration the herbs, Elias had gestured to the vast, shimmering field. He had explained that herbs could be regrown, but a person, once gone, was lost forever. It was only after Elias was taken in the other timeline, when the entire grove withered to dust in an instant, that Caleb understood. The endless bounty wasn't a feature of the land. It was a direct extension of Elias's own life force. He had supported the entire spire on his own strength. Marcus remained on his knees, seething with resentment. He lamented that Caleb had just returned from the brink of death and he did not wish to argue, but that such slander was impossible to bear. He recounted how Elias had saved him at the age of 10, how he owed him his life. He admitted he wasn't as gifted as Caleb, but insisted his devotion and hard work were unmatched. The lie was sickeningly potent. At 9, Marcus's own parents had sold him into servitude. When he escaped and returned, they beat him half to death and left him to freeze in the snow. It was Elias who found him, paid his indenture, and gave him a new life. Elias had saved a viper. That viper not only conspired with their enemies but had, in another life, crushed Elias's hands under his heel and carved that defiling brand onto his brow. Caleb pushed the glob of liquid closer to Marcus's lips again, his voice cold. He challenged Marcus to drink it and prove how much of his pathetic whining was true. Marcus's gaze shot to Elias, a desperate question in his eyes. He asked if Elias truly believed the accusation. He spoke of how a heart couldn't be balanced on two sides, that it was natural for Elias to favor the gifted Caleb. He then declared that he had brewed the medicine with his own hands, so what did it matter if he drank it to prove his innocence? As he swallowed the liquid, a faint wisp of purple vapor separated from it. Instantly, Solstice leaped from its rack, a flash of silver light streaking toward the vapor to contain it. Just then, the doors swung open. Other disciples, drawn by the commotion, crowded the entrance. Someone, seeing Solstice moving toward Marcus, cried out for Elias to stop. Leah rushed forward, placing herself between the sword and Marcus. In that moment of hesitation, the wisp of purple vapor dissipated into nothing. A flicker of triumph crossed Marcus's face. Disciples began to murmur their support for him, questioning why Caleb's sword was drawn on his fellow student. Some even blamed Caleb for Elias getting injured in the first place. With the evidence gone, Marcus straightened his back. He calmly explained that Caleb had suspected him of poisoning the medicine, and that he had drunk it himself to prove his innocence. The crowd's perception shifted, their gazes turning on Caleb with suspicion. Elias's voice cut through the noise. He stated that if there was no poison, Solstice would not have drawn itself. His brow furrowed as his gaze swept over the crowd. Marcus countered smoothly, explaining that he had added frostroot to the mixture. He claimed that while the herb was toxic, its properties could be neutralized to create a powerful remedy. He looked to Leah, identifying her as someone from the Green Hollow apothecary who could vouch for his knowledge. Leah picked up a shard of the broken bowl and sniffed it. She confirmed the presence of frostroot. Her expression filled with disappointment as she looked at Caleb, telling him he had seen Marcus's dedication with his own eyes and shouldn't slander him. Others echoed her sentiment. Voices rose, questioning what would have happened to Marcus if Leah hadn't intervened. Someone dared to suggest that perhaps Elias, weary from his injury, had lost control of his legendary blade. One by one, they sided with Marcus, seemingly forgetting who had saved them, trained them, and sustained them for years. It was just like before. After Elias had fallen, these same people had disowned him, their pride as disciples of Silverwood Spire turning to shame. When Caleb had tried to rally them for a rescue, not a single one would help. They had spat his name, blaming him for his own downfall, whispering that a man of his stature should not have consorted with the blighted. Their words were even viler, comparing him to the lowest of courtesans. God's bane hummed in Caleb's hand, sensing his rage. It would be easy to cut Marcus down. The scorn of these blind fools meant nothing to him. But he glanced at Elias, standing beside him. Without proof, he feared only Elias's misunderstanding. He forced God's bane back into its sheath. The sword protested with a low thrum. Marcus, helped to his feet by others, adopted a magnanimous air. He told Caleb that he would forgive him this one time, as he knew Caleb was only concerned for Elias. But he added a condescending that the purpose of sword practice was to cultivate character, and Caleb should not raise his blade against his brethren without cause. Caleb's reply was sharp. He told Marcus that for someone with his meager talent, perhaps swordplay was merely for character. He gripped Godsbane's hilt. For him, it was different. He trained so that one day he could protect those he cared about, and to strip the masks from hypocrites, leaving their rotten cores exposed for all to see. As the crowd dispersed, with Leah helping Marcus away, the hall fell silent. Caleb swayed, the world turning black at the edges, his body supported only by his sword. A strong hand steadied him. It was Elias. His dark hair framed a face of serene calm, his silver eyes peaceful. Sensing the tremor in Caleb's body, he patted his hand reassuringly. He told Caleb not to be afraid. Caleb grabbed his sleeve, a desperate urgency in his voice. He warned Elias that failing to deal with Marcus today meant the threat remained. He had to believe him. He insisted Marcus was colluding with the Blighted, that he wanted to. The final words, too vile to speak, died on his tongue, lest they taint Elias's ears. Elias listened patiently. He acknowledged that among the many gifted disciples, perhaps Marcus, being less so, felt overlooked. He admitted that perhaps he had been neglectful, allowing resentment to grow. He promised to investigate the collusion with the Blighted, and if it were true, he would not spare him. Over the next few days, as Caleb recovered, Leah brought him medicine. Each time, he would casually ask about Marcus. Knowing of her affection for him, Caleb feigned remorse for his actions. He told her he had been under the influence of a nightmare, induced by a phantasm he'd encountered on his mission. In the vision, he saw Marcus poison Elias and then slaughter everyone at Silverwood Spire. He claimed the terror of the vision had caused him to lose control. Leah's face went pale. She knew that some phantasms could weave visions of the future. She asked for a description. Caleb, feigning a hazy memory, described a creature with crimson horns and a barbed tail, unlike any spirit he'd seen before. From his few words, Leah, with her extensive knowledge, guessed the creature's nature. She left in a hurry, telling him not to speak of it to anyone else. Caleb watched her go, a small, grim smile on his face. People are indifferent until their own lives are at stake. Soon, rumors spread. Disciples began to avoid Marcus. Those who already disliked him grew bolder in their scorn. They mocked his title of eldest brother, pointing out that his level of skill was laughably low for his age. Marcus had to endure their jibes while maintaining his facade of a kind, patient senior, his inner rage festering. When Caleb had fully recovered, he made his face appear even paler with a dusting of powder. He went to the training grounds where Marcus was instructing others from a high platform. In front of everyone, Caleb offered a deeply emotional apology. With tears in his eyes, he blamed the phantasm's vision for his outburst and begged for Marcus's forgiveness. Then, he presented a rare frostroot, explaining he had found it in the grove that Elias tended to, offering it as a token of his sincerity. The disciples below stopped their training, all eyes on the drama unfolding. Marcus's face twitched. He knew who was behind the rumors, but he couldn't lash out publicly. He forced a benevolent smile, accepting the apology and telling Caleb to come to him if he needed anything while Elias was in seclusion. Caleb thanked him and stood humbly to the side. Then, a disciple caught the key phrase. "Elias's grove?" he asked, confused, stating that everyone knew Marcus was the one who tended the sacred grove. Indeed, many had seen Marcus working there. Caleb blinked with practiced innocence, his voice carrying clearly to everyone present. He explained that Elias constantly nurtured the grove with his own essence, which was the only reason such rare herbs could thrive there. Every plant they picked contained a fragment of their master's power, tended by his will even from seclusion. Faced with this, Marcus could only force a smile and agree that it had always been Elias's work, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the seed of doubt had sprouted. The disciples, who respected power above all, had revered Marcus largely because they believed he controlled access to the life-saving herbs. One disciple shouted that Marcus had once given him a rare blood-drunk herb for a grievous injury, claiming he'd cultivated it for years. It was all a lie. Another decried him as a fraud. The tide of opinion turned completely. Marcus looked desperately to Leah in the crowd, but the girl who had always followed him admiringly now took a step back, avoiding his gaze. Into this chaos, a new presence arrived. A figure descended on a flying sword. His aura so immense that every blade on the training ground began to hum and tremble violently. God's bane thrashed in Caleb's grip. Caleb looked up into the face of Lord Valerius, the legendary weapon forger. It was he who, in another life, had forged the soul-forged shackles. Valerius demanded to know where Elias was. A disciple stammered that he was in seclusion. Valerius sighed, then asked about his sword. He claimed to have acquired a piece of star-forged iron, perfect for reforging solstice. Of all the people Elias associated with, Valerius was one of the most frequent visitors. He had forged solstice itself. But he was another two-faced monster. Even after poisoning Elias, they had feared his power, so Valerius had created the shackles to bind him permanently. Valerius pointed at Marcus, ordering him to lead the way to Elias's chambers. His gaze then fell on Caleb and on the sword in his hand. A glint of avarice appeared in his eyes. He asked for the sword's name, remarking that it was a fine blade for one so young. With a gesture, God's bane was pulled from Caleb's hand and flew toward him. Valerius poured his own essence into the blade, trying to break Caleb's connection and claim it for himself, but the sword resisted him fiercely. Caleb's voice was steady. He told the Lord its name was God's bane. Valerius laughed, a sound full of arrogance. He mocked the name, stating that ascendants were immortal. Caleb met his gaze without flinching. He replied that since Valerius was the only ascendant present, perhaps he should test the blade's name for himself. Valerius scoffed and turned away, Marcus trailing behind him like a shadow. The others were pressing their advantage now that Elias was in seclusion. They couldn't let him tamper with solstice. Caleb turned to the other disciples, his voice loud and persuasive, suggesting they all follow to witness how a master forger works. At the door to Elias's chambers, which still bore the scar of Caleb's earlier entry, Valerius paused. He asked Marcus who had made the mark. Caleb stepped forward from the crowd behind him and claimed responsibility. Valerius frowned at the large group that had followed. He declared that he did not like to be watched while he worked and ordered them all to leave. But Caleb was relentless. He pointed out that Marcus was hardly skilled enough to assist, but there were many accomplished swordsmen among them who could help. Valerius's patience wore thin. He sneered, mentioning that the star-forged iron was priceless, and that with the ethereal conclave only 3 months away, it was strange he wasn't using it for his own disciples. Someone, it was Leah, tugged on Caleb's sleeve, whispering for him to stop. Everyone knew Lord Valerius was a powerful master but a terrible teacher. His sect always placed last in the conclave. Caleb ignored her and pressed on, his voice ringing with accusation. He asked if Valerius's friendship with Elias was so profound. He reminded everyone that years ago, Elias's own sword had shattered while saving Valerius's life. Valerius had promised a new blade in return. After forging Solstice, he had repeatedly requested rare herbs and medicines from Elias. Every visit from Valerius left a patch of the grove barren. Caleb accused him of leveraging a debt of gratitude for years of gain. How could such a calculating man selflessly offer a priceless material right before the conclave? Caleb planted the final seed of doubt. Perhaps Valerius intended to sabotage the sword. Enraged, Valerius yelled for him to be silent. His own sword unsheathed and shot toward Caleb's heart. Caleb stood his ground, raising God's bane to meet it. He would lose an arm before he let this man touch Elias's sword. The clash of steel was deafening. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through the air, knocking back the other disciples. Just as Caleb's arm went numb, a flash of silver intervened. Solstice had left its rack. It deflected Valerius's blade with an almost contemptuous ease. "You overstep yourself, Valerius." The voice was calm but held an edge of steel. Elias stood at the entrance to his Madion chamber, his seclusion broken. Solstice flew to his side, circling him affectionately before returning to its sheath at his command. Leah rushed to support the staggering Caleb, quickly explaining what had transpired. Valerius, furious, sputtered that he had come with a gift, only to be slandered by Elias's insolent pupil. Elias walked forward until he stood between his disciples and the enraged Lord. He stated that Solstice was fine as it was. And, he added, his disciples were also fine, and they did not require discipline from an outsider. Humiliated, Valerius turned and stormed away. That night, Marcus and a few other disciples left the spire with him. The ethereal conclave arrived. Elias took only Caleb with him. Upon their arrival, many sect leaders gathered around Elias, offering greetings. One of them eyed Caleb dismissively, remarking that Silverwood Spire seemed either overconfident or dismissive of the competition. Elias's reply was simple: "He is enough." Across the bustling square, Caleb felt a hostile gaze. Lord Valerius was seated in a place of honor, and standing behind him was Marcus. His face was no longer a mask of false humility, but a canvas of open contempt. The sword at his side glowed with a malevolent red light. The pairings were announced. Caleb found his name next to Marcus's. Before their match, Marcus sneered, calling him little brother for the last time. On the dueling platform, he warned, "Blades have no eyes." Caleb's response was devoid of emotion. He told Marcus that evil reaps what it sows, and that he would be sure to send more company for him on his road to damnation. The fight began. Marcus's sword blazed, a captive phoenix spirit crying within the steel. He accused Caleb of being arrogant, of thinking his talent made the efforts of others worthless. He vowed to show him that even a prodigy could fall. Caleb drew God's bane. It vibrated with anticipation. He retorted that Marcus's problem was never a lack of talent, but a lack of satisfaction. He was always comparing himself to those above him, then blaming his failures on a lack of innate gift instead of a lack of true diligence. No matter the weapon, Marcus was destined to be his lesser. The phoenix was a divine creature. Marcus's tainted essence could never truly command it. With a motion like lightning, God's bane struck. Marcus watched in horror as his own blade refused his command. The phoenix within fell silent. When the swords met, the phoenix blade shattered into 1,000 pieces. A spectral image of the bird erupted from the shards and vanished. As Marcus collapsed, vomiting blood from the backlash, Caleb advanced. He reminded him of the sword's name. In another life, Elias lay on a straw mat, a brand on his forehead. An elder overseeing the match called Caleb's name, ordering him to stop. but Caleb's eyes were crimson with fury. He ripped open Marcus's tunic and, with the tip of God's bane, carved the same brand of servitude into his chest. He asked Marcus if he remembered the snow, and what his fate would have been had Elias not saved him. From his seat, Lord Valerius rose in a fury, launching an attack at Caleb. But Solstice appeared, blocking the blow. Elias's voice cut through the arena, cool and sharp. On the dueling platform, blades have no eyes. Were those not your own disciples' words? Ignoring the commotion, Caleb brought his sword to Marcus's forehead, then slowly lowered it to his abdomen. Instead of killing him, he thrust the blade in and shattered his core of essence. As Marcus screamed and went limp, Caleb addressed the judges. He declared Marcus a traitor who had stolen sacred herbs and betrayed his master. He had only dispensed the punishment Elias was too merciful to give. The presiding elder, though disapproving, declared Silverwood's spire the victor. Elias stepped onto the platform and stood before Caleb. He revealed that he had found a packet of powdered drunkbone grass, a potent poison, buried in Marcus's old courtyard. As per the law, Marcus was to be executed for his crimes. Lying on the ground, Marcus reached a bloody hand toward Elias, his throat croaking his master's name. But this time, Elias did not even grant him a glance. They left the conclave early. At the foot of the mountain, they passed a slave trader. For the price of a single copper coin, Caleb sold Marcus to him. Finally, the nightmare was over. Elias reached out and brushed a stray petal from Caleb's hair. "Let's go home," he said. Their path was blocked. Lord Valerius stood before them, dozens of swords hovering in the air around him. He demanded they leave Solstice behind, claiming he had forged it, and so it belonged to him. Caleb noticed a small, gray bird with red eyes perched on a nearby branch, a scryer bird linked to one of his fellow disciples. He met Valerius's claim with scorn, recounting the debt the Lord owed. Just then, a clear bell chimed. Leah arrived, leading a large contingent of disciples from Silverwood Spire. They hurled insults at the disgraced Lord, forming a protective wall behind Elias and Caleb. Caleb stepped forward, ready to fight, but Elias stopped him, taking God's bane from his hand. "My turn," he said. As Elias advanced, Valerius's smile turned cruel. He asked if Elias regretted saving him all those years ago. A dark gleam of metal flashed in his palm. It was the soul-forged shackles. "Master, be careful," Caleb yelled. He grabbed Solstice. The sword resisted for a moment, then accepted his essence as he lunged for Valerius's wrist. At the same moment, the dozens of swords around Valerius shattered. Solstice severed the Lord's hand, and God's bane pierced his heart. Miles away, his soul lamp extinguished. The ascendant dissolved into dust, the shackles clattering to the ground before vanishing into purple smoke. Elias pulled God's bane free, his expression unreadable. He did not regret saving him, he said, only that he hadn't ended him sooner when his greed became apparent. On the walk back up the mountain, surrounded by cheering disciples, Caleb asked Elias if he had known Valerius was hiding the shackles. Elias's voice was soft. He spoke of a dream he'd had months ago, after Caleb's encounter with the phantasm. He had seen a vision of the future, a glimpse into heaven's design. He saw himself broken and branded, pinned to the ground by those same shackles. He was filthy, but a young man had shattered his bonds and covered him with a cloak, preserving his dignity. He could never see the young man's face, but he saw the sword he carried, a blade like autumn frost that could strike down spirits and fell immortals. Caleb reached out and caught the sleeve of Elias's robe. He looked up at his master, whose white robes seemed to shine in the moonlight. He shook his head slowly. You were never filthy. Elias was like the moon in the sky, a brilliant, unattainable light. He belonged on his pedestal, forever untouched by the dust of the world.